Welcome, welcome, Miss Heather K. Ling. Oh my God, I love your handle so much, by the way, because
Thank you.
I've always loved K as a name. I wish I was named that, but that's
It's
okay.
it's my Chinese name.
Oh, really?
Yeah, KK.
Oh,
Mhm.
oh, okay, perfect. So yeah, that's like double good because I also like Heather, and I also like it, and I don't, I'm only going to say this on the record once, but I don't put my last name out there because number one, I had to go through kind of a nasty cyber stalking thing a few years back. So I'm like, okay, so like off of everything, right? Number two, I have one of those really unique last names. So if you try to search for me, I'm one of two to exist. And so let's not do that, you know? So that's why I use my last initial. But you, on the other hand, yeah, I love the way it sounds also because it's very, I don't know, it's like a nice balance to the three parts. Don't know how you feel about your name, but I love it. So
Thank
yeah.
you. I appreciate it.
So why don't we jump into I know a bit about you, but why don't you let our listeners know who you are? You know, just you can start and then we'll work from there.
Yeah, so I'm Heather. I am a pediatric dietitian by day and
Mm,
an audiobook narrator by night. I just started audiobook narration, but that's really it about me, short and
mm,
sweet.
Yeah, that's like a great superhero intro also because it's like saving lives during the day and also like saving not say I don't want to say saving
Saving
lives
babies,
saving
feeding
yeah
babies.
exactly yeah yeah and I love the day night because I also think that's how you manage your life, right? Like you go to work like hospital clinic right during the day and then
Yes.
at night you're in your closet I think also.
Yes, I'm in my
Yeah,
closet.
everyone can see my closet. I like I moved my red dress today because you know it was showing up, but it's really really awesome I think because so many people feel that maybe I don't know. We know what it's like to live and work a 9 to 5, right? And it's like I, I don't care how passionate you are, things burn you out, right? And to have something to kind of offset that, I think is a fantastic. Like your name, I feel like it's balanced. So I feel like it's
Thank
like
you.
yeah,
All
all
about
around.
balance.
Yes, exactly. So you and I connected because you posted on Threads conversation with your father on
Yeah.
yeah, maybe like we just want to fill everyone in how we got connected, what the you know that conversation was about, and kind of we can go a little bit into how you were raised as well.
Yeah. So our threads conversation or my threads post that you responded to was in response to when I asked my dad his opinion about these little business cards I had developed. It was just like the mock, and I took a picture of it, and I asked my dad what he thought. And his response was, "It's so Asian."
Mm,
And he was like, don't you want to market yourself to a more international audience and not to limit yourself to
mm,
putting yourself in this box of being Asian?
yeah.
And, you know, on my post, I kind of asked, like, authors, would you choose to not hire me based on the fact that I'm Asian and my marketing material had Asian graphics on it, essentially?
Mm, mm,
Would that deter an author from hiring me?
mm,
It just kind of brings along like my dad's view is in order to survive as an immigrant, that you had to assimilate.
mm,
And assimilation was survival. And he didn't say it in a bad way. He wanted, he wanted it to be like, I want to help you. And my view is if you made yourself more marketable to everybody,
mhm,
and he felt like being Asian limited me, and he
mhm.
wants the best for me. So that's why he made that comment.
Right. And Asian design or marketing material, it was, I think you told me before it was like clouds or,
It was clouds.
okay, yeah,
So you know, like in Asian artwork, there's
right.
like the circular, like pretty clouds,
Mm,
and that's what it was.
mm-hmm, mm-hmm. That is, see, I think this is interesting because it's perception, right? Like you see clouds and you'd have to know the reference to be connecting it to that. Because I think some people looking at, I haven't seen what you, I can
I know
imagine,
I
right? Like
didn't
I know
bring
what you're
it,
talking
but I
about. Yeah.
forgot I left it downstairs.
You know what? We're gonna add this in if you agree to the show notes so that people can see, you know,
Yeah.
the card that you're talking about. But I feel it's a matter of history, personal history, background. Like, I have a sister that studied art, and so through her, I was exposed to a lot of different forms, and of course, I can recognize things. Would everyone, even if they were born Asian, would they recognize it? I think that's the interesting thing. So, and you mentioned that you were actually one of those lucky few raised in a non ultra traditional Asian American family. Can you talk a little bit about that, your family's kind of like cultural history?
Yeah, it's pretty complicated, but I feel like every immigrant story is complicated.
Yeah.
So my dad is from Hong Kong. He immigrated here in his 20s, I think. And he is Chinese. I speak Cantonese at home. So that's pretty straightforward. My mom's side is a little different. This is where it gets a little convoluted, is that she's from Vietnam and she's considered Vietnamese, but she is ethnically Chinese also. There's a
Mm,
Chinatown in
mm,
every country.
yeah.
So that's kind of like where she grew up in Vietnam, but she also speaks Cantonese. She speaks Cantonese, she speaks Vietnamese, she speaks Mandarin, and
Mm,
of
mm,
course, English. So at home, I was raised speaking Cantonese.
mm,
That's the difference. So like my mom was a Vietnamese refugee and my dad was a Chinese immigrant from Hong Kong.
mm. Was it a choice between the two of them to choose Cantonese as the home language?
So I guess this is where like patriarchy kind of comes into play.
Nice. Yeah.
Um, I
Great.
mean, my dad doesn't speak Vietnamese,
Mm, mm,
but my mom speaks Cantonese.
mm,
So actually, in even on my mom's side, for those of us who do speak another language, so besides English, we all speak Cantonese. I
mm,
think at home they all spoke mostly Cantonese to each other.
mhm,
So it was also more of like the natural progression just to teach their children Cantonese.
mm,
None of us know Vietnamese. And I think
mm,
it was almost intentional
mm,
because when we go to family gatherings,
mm.
the Vietnamese brothers and sisters can speak Vietnamese to each other and no one else understands them.
Wow. There are so many layers to unpack with this, so let's go slowly. Let's go,
Yeah.
piece by piece. I'm wondering, let's just back up to your mother's story, right? So meaning her family kind of background was in mainland China, right? So,
Hmm.
and then she was born and raised in Vietnam, is that right?
Yes.
Okay.
I'm not
And
really sure. Sorry.
no, no, no,
I'm
go
not
ahead.
really sure when their families moved to
Yeah.
Vietnam. We're
Mm-hmm.
not really sure. We haven't really asked too much. There's just so much
Yeah.
history.
Yeah.
Um, but
Yeah,
yeah.
yeah. Well, the reason I'm wondering is because also her experience is also a story of immigration, right? Many people think that Asian equals one country, and no, not at all. And also not even one culture, right? And it's not about splitting it apart. It's more that that part of the family had to move, or she at least had to move, right? Integrate, assimilate into Vietnam. I'm wondering how she was treated, welcomed, that sort of stuff. I don't know if you know, but and then your parents also, so I assume then that they didn't meet in Vietnam if your dad doesn't speak Vietnamese.
Mhm. Yeah,
Yeah.
they met here in the US.
Mm-hmm. So that's another layer of it, right? Because it's two separate immigration stories that then kind of fuse here and then influence the decision to, I guess, how they raised you, what languages or, what language you were exposed to at home. And for sure, patriarchy always comes back to rear its lovely head all the time, all the time, especially in Eastern cultures. So let's kind of then unpack. Do you have siblings?
I do.
Mm,
So I have an older sister who is actually also my half sister, which
mm,
kind of convolutes the story more.
mm,
But
mm,
she
mm.
immigrated or she was a refugee with my mom from Vietnam.
I see.
So she
Okay.
was born in Vietnam. We don't know who her father is or
Mm,
if he's still alive, if he passed during the war, who
mm,
knows?
mm.
But she's my half sister and she's 11 years older than me.
And then this is your kind of you grew up together and you were raised in it. So then does she also speak Canto?
Yeah, she also speaks
Yeah.
Cantonese. Yeah. And she
Yeah, yeah.
doesn't know any Vietnamese either. So,
Yeah. That's really the point about shutting people out maybe as a form of like a literal barrier, right? Formed by language. I think that is a universal experience, number one, but when it's intentional, there is an element of malice that I think, I don't know, have you ever considered and this is more of a personal thing rather than family obligation, learning Vietnamese just so you can have like a little insider like window.
Uh, I mean, I think maybe when I was younger,
Mm,
but now like there are just so many languages,
mm,
and there are others I would be more interested in learning than
mm,
Vietnamese.
mm,
I think I just had a lot of exposure, and the fact that I never grew so curious that I begged to learn kind of
mm,
indicates that I never truly had a passion for that language for
mm,
whatever reason.
hmm.
So not entirely.
What are the other languages then that you think you'd rather learn?
Yeah, so I mean, going through history of learning and going to school,
Yeah.
so I learned Spanish in high school, as most kids do. I learned it because we had to pick a foreign language, and Spanish was supposedly easier than French. I
Mm.
totally regretted that decision when I grew up, by the way.
Really?
I think French is the most beautiful language out there. And I actually tried to I took a few courses in French because I did a short study abroad in
Mm.
France on the
Mm.
microbiology of cheese and wine.
Oh, wow. Okay. Where in
Yeah.
France?
In Burgundy.
Okay, yeah, makes sense.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
So that was clearly a lot of fun. The course
Mm,
was taught in English, of
mm,
course,
mm,
but getting around,
yeah.
we're in Cluny, which was like the small
Mm,
town, so not everyone spoke English. So even a little bit of French, could get you a little
mm-hmm,
further.
mm-hmm.
Um, but it is a hard language to learn and a difficult language to practice. So there's that. But
Yeah.
also during like the COVID lockdown,
Mm.
I got into K-dramas, and
Ah.
then I started learning Korean just to better understand like the nuances,
Mm,
because in Korean, if since we're talking specifically about that, there's a hierarchy, and that hierarchy is expressed through their language, and
yeah.
it doesn't come across in subtitles.
Right.
And I felt like learning the language would
Ah,
bring about all these cultural nuances that,
right.
as an English speaker reading English subtitles, I would have missed out on.
Number one, it's so funny that you said that you chose to learn Spanish because that's also why I chose to learn Spanish. Because I think we don't have a uniform nor standardized education system in the country, but most of us do have to choose oftentimes between Spanish or French. I don't know why it's always these two, right? But yeah, I heard also like, yeah, just take Spanish because it's easier and it's like the closest thing to English and it's an easy A. And I mean, once you get up there, like intermediate and above, like you're conjugating a lot. So it's not an easy A
No.
actually. So, and I always say this, I never, 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 never thought I would learn French, much less have it be such a massive aspect of my life. But I don't know if you were told this. I was always told, like, why are you an Asian person learning Spanish? Like, it's like my school told me I had to choose. So, did you get those comments?
No,
Mm,
I think everyone just kind of knew it was a requirement in school.
mm,
But speaking of like an Asian person learning Spanish who also has another language under their belt
mm,
already, several of my cousins are fairly fluent in Spanish.
mm, mm,
Like one has lived in El Salvador,
mm,
the other has studied in Barcelona.
mm,
My cousin's husband is a Spanish minor.
mm,
I have my other cousin who actually I think this weekend is getting married and to a Colombian, so
mm,
he speaks Spanish also.
mm.
So there's actually a lot of Spanish speakers in my family.
Yeah, yeah. And you're originally, you said, from New Jersey, is that correct? Okay.
Yes.
So, but right now you're living in Texas.
Yes.
Yeah. And we know how wonderful it is to have Spanish skills, right? In like all parts of the US, but for sure towards the south, like southern border. I wonder if it's also kind of become more popular or accepted to be multilingual, bilingual at least in this country. I don't know if you've kind of thought about this as well, but in my area of Washington, D.C., like, born and raised area, there are so many people trying to get their kids to absorb languages. So they'll do those like multi-immersion
Yeah.
programs, like the super efficient, like do math in Spanish and then history in French, and then
Yeah.
so do you? I don't know, in your family, your network, anything, have you seen that happen for the next generation?
Yes, so when I was still living in the Northeast, one of my friends, she was going to put her daughter in a Spanish immersion school, but they also speak Spanish at home. Her husband is from Spain, and she taught Spanish also. So it only
Mm,
made sense for them to want to incorporate that more solidly in their
mm,
child's life.
mm-hmm,
And then here, there are also a lot of Spanish immersion schools
mm,
here in Texas.
mm,
So I do see it. I think Spanish is one language that's a little easier in the US because there are so many Spanish speakers.
yeah.
I do find the ones who want their children to speak, their native language, it's a
Mm,
lot harder, especially when only one parent speaks it.
mm,
And then they'll have the intention of teaching, for example, Chinese. They had the
mm.
intention of teaching Chinese to their child, but then because it's easier to speak to their spouse in English,
Uh,
then, it all gets muddled and they're like, we're just gonna just all speak English.
I think the utility of languages is something that we can recognize because we have a multilingual society. But I don't see yet. And so, by the way, I agree. I agree with everything you're saying. I just also realized that so many people are focused on getting, it's like almost like get the language in, right? Like go and like pack the brain with all these different things. I wonder if we can kind of talk about the expectation or the burden of being a speaker of a certain language in a family setting, right? So no matter which language it is that your parents chose or your family chose, how did you live that out? So you're a Canto speaker, which by the way, oh God, I feel like we should go over the difference
Yeah,
between Canto and Mandarin first. Can you talk about that?
there's so much history
Yeah.
involved.
Yeah.
But China is a massive country. There
Yeah.
are so many different languages within China, but the like national language is Mandarin. So no
Yeah.
matter what Chinese language you speak, everyone does learn Mandarin.
Right.
And then in the Guangdong area of China, which is like the southeast area,
Mm-hmm.
there are Cantonese speakers. That's the
Mm-hmm.
region for Cantonese.
Mm-hmm.
And even with that, like there are nuances, like in English, right? In the US,
Yeah.
there's the Southern accent, there's,
Yeah.
the Northern accent, the Boston, New York accent. So even Cantonese can sound different, but Hong Kong specifically speaks Cantonese. That's since that's where my dad is from, that's the language I learned. There's also more history because of the British colonization. There's
Yeah.
also a lot of English loan words in the
Mm,
Cantonese language,
mm,
at least if you're from Hong Kong.
mm. So this illustrates the perfectly the difference between accent and dialect, right? Because I was often asked as a Mandarin child, okay, well, like, it's Chinese. So, like, basically, Cantonese is just like a different way of saying it. No, no. Like, I can't understand anything. Cantonese people who weren't exposed to Mandarin or forced to learn it, at a young age, like, you can kind of get certain words ish, but it's like
Yeah.
not at all the same, right? And then on top of that, yes, you add in the history with Great Britain, with like all that stuff, right? So you essentially have this mishmash of wonderful, it's a very technical term, by the way, of all of these influences. And that also further solidifies the point that Hong Kong itself is quite different from the other Canto speaking parts of the region. So, okay, in your family, how did this then play out? How did this kind of I don't know, think back to when you were like baby Heather, like a little Canto speaker and also bilingual English speaker, right? Like
Yeah.
how did that process in your head?
So there's so many nuances to all of this,
Yeah.
considering also my mom is from Vietnam
Yeah.
and speaks Cantonese. So if you listen to my family speak from the ones who married Cantonese speakers from Hong Kong versus those who married other Vietnamese speakers,
Mm,
there's actually an accent in my family. It ranges from very Hong Kong to ranging to like having a Vietnamese accent when they
mm,
speak Cantonese.
mm.
But for me growing up, I actually didn't learn English until I went to school.
Okay.
They spoke strictly Cantonese to me at home. They were like, we're in the US. She will learn English going to school, but she
Right.
won't learn Chinese. So we're
Right.
only going to speak to her in Cantonese at home. So at first, it was. it was fine until I went to school and I realized I didn't understand what everyone was
Yeah.
saying,
Yeah.
and I had to take ESL. And their parents are like, "Oh, but that must be so jarring for a child. There would be trauma, etc." Honestly, I was so young. I remember a few things. I remember not understanding the teacher's instructions, but I don't feel trauma from it. Was it a little
Mm,
scary? Sure. I think the biggest part was I didn't speak to others
mm,
for a very long time. Like
mm,
the teachers knew I could talk, but I guess the other classmates were like, there was one time we were playing tag, and I remember this very clearly.
mm,
And I shouted something at, one other student, and she
mm.
stopped in the middle of the game of tag,
Mm.
turned around, and was like, "You can talk?"
Oh my God.
And I was like, "Yes." Like I had
Yeah.
other friends, but we are just overall more quiet.
Right.
So I think that was the biggest influence in my life with language and being bilingual and people not
Mm,
thinking I could speak versus like
mm.
at home, we all spoke Cantonese. So I didn't feel a difference.
Mm, mm. That is so much more common than I think we realize. Being born and raised in the country, but being sent to ESL because your family isn't a native English speaking environment, and therefore you didn't learn, like, how would you have absorbed the language, right? Like,
TV.
yeah, exactly. Or like grocery store, like what? Because, like I've had obviously family members that were sent. I think the difference for me was I have an older sister, and they kind of learned already with her, like we have to be more intentional, or else this is going to happen again. So it's not like a whole trauma thing, but it was like a surprising thing, right, for the family to be putting their kid that they consider like you're born here, you're American, and go. And it's like, no, wait, here, the preliminary step. So I had Mandarin completely at home, but then when I went to school, I think the fact that I was already in sports from like the age of 1. So like, I had coaches and stuff. So I didn't talk either, by the way.
Hmm.
That was often fused together with the Asian female stereotype. And I don't think I really found a way to vocally express until like 11 or so, because you're just, what you just talked about, like I probably said like 5 words, before that age. So was it the same for your sister?
No.
Mm,
So my sister and I are very different.
mm,
Um, so again, she's 11 years older than me, and she went to schools that were predominantly white.
mm,
She was the token Asian.
mm,
And when I grew up, I went to a predominantly white school also, but then we moved to one that
mm,
had a lot more diversity. There was a
mm,
huge Asian population.
mm,
And the difference between our upbringing is that she remained in a school system where she also had to learn to assimilate.
mm,
So a lot of her views are similar actually to my dad's views,
mm,
that you have to erase as much as your root
mm,
identity as you can. And like there were comments like, oh, they're more Asian, even though they're not Asian.
mm,
This non Asian is more Asian than my sister. And they would make
mm,
comments like that,
mm.
because for her survival, she also had to do something like assimilate. And now that
Yeah.
she's getting older, she wants to add more culture back to her life.
Mm.
Whereas for me, I grew up in the generation of Asian pride. I
Yeah.
don't know if
Yeah, yeah,
you
yeah.
the
Yeah.
whole yeah. So
Yeah.
that was how I grew up in
Yeah.
the school system and with the Asian population that I grew up in. It
Yeah.
was you're proud
Yeah.
of your heritage, and
Right.
Asian pride was a huge thing for me growing up. So
Yeah.
I was able to retain a lot more of my background in a way without
Mm.
feeling the urge to have to remove it.
Right.
Being confident in myself as someone who is quieter,
Mm.
who is okay with sitting on the outskirts and observing in,
Mm.
because that's who I am. Whereas my
Mm.
sister is the opposite. She is louder, more
Mm.
boisterous. She
Mm.
walks into a room and there she is. But again, that was her way of assimilating and surviving.
Mm-hmm. I feel that it really is dependent on not only which country, and yes, you keep saying, I forget which word you're using, but it's like all this backstory and history, right? Like woven in, and it's always so specific, and that's exactly the way to look at it, right? So even in the same family, and my sister and I are really different also, and it's also because born at different times, family dynamic was different. I was raised by my grandparents, like primarily, right? So like all that changes. And when you look at how the outside world kind of views us, they're like, oh, so sisters, okay. Oh, Chinese American family, okay. It's the same. And it's like, it is not the same. It is not even the same between sisters. It is not the same between cousins. It's not the same between like, second and third and aunts and uncles. And yeah, kind of a personal, but looking at the like generational kind of impact of it. Did your parents retain a certain accent then when they started speaking English? Would you say that they kind of, and the reason I ask this is because that's also a difference in my family. It's very, very different depending on the backstory.
Yeah, so in Hong Kong, my dad learned English
Mm,
there. So
mm,
he came to the US already having English knowledge.
mm,
And he worked really hard on, erasing his accent.
mm,
That being said, he does have an accent. My mom came as an adult also. My mom's English is actually not very good at all.
mm,
Um, she has worked hard and she would actually record herself
mm,
and then listen back to it because it's hard. Like, you think you're saying or pronouncing a word correctly. I remember one word specifically. She would have her recorder and I would record how to say it. The specific word is shape.
mm,
For some reason she couldn't say the word shape and she was like, "No, I'm saying it." And we're like, "Okay, well, why don't you record yourself saying it and you
mm,
can listen and you can compare." And she kept saying shop, shop.
mm,
So she had to practice a lot and record herself over and over and over again until she could get the word shape.
right.
Um, and so her English isn't as good. So I mainly speak to her in Cantonese,
Mm.
unless we're having an argument and I'm like, well, I'm angry now. You don't have to understand what I'm saying. I'm going to start like spewing English really fast and you're just going to be
Yeah. Yeah, yeah, yeah,
lost.
yeah.
Yeah. So in my family, so the Hong Kong speakers all speak pretty good English, and then the ones from Vietnam who also speak Vietnamese, it varies just on how much effort they
Mm,
took to go to school.
mm,
Like I have a doctor in the family, and of course his English is great.
mm.
So it still ranges, like you said, in the family. It just depends on what they ended up focusing on.
Yeah. The general, how do I want to put this? Hollywood and media have not been kind nor accurate in the demonstration and representation. I can't even call it representation, and we're talking Asian. We're not even talking specifically Chinese or, parts of China. That kind of family model, because I think I surprise people when I tell them that most of that generation in my family does not speak with that stereotypical Chinese accent. Like
Yeah.
it's something that is both, it's great because we can have a conversation like, way, like learning moment, right? Um, but it's also a little frustrating because it's like, how could you actually think that people aren't living different things? And so you mentioned like someone working as a doctor needing to interface with patients every single day is really, really different than somebody who doesn't need to use the language or like maybe also chose not to put extra work on their accent, right? So I'm wondering if we can shift into talking more about the intersections of like just everything we just spoke about, but also your work both as a dietitian and also in the not podcast, you don't have a podcast yet, in the narration audiobook kind of sphere. So how I guess, how do we want to do this? Let's have you talk about your day job first.
Yeah. So in my day job, I'm a pediatric dietitian. Most of my job is helping kids grow. So yes, obesity is an epidemic, and I do see obese children. And I also see the other end. I see malnutrition because not all infants grow and thrive as they should. And that's essentially my job. But here in Texas, There's a huge Spanish speaking population, but we also have a huge Vietnamese speaking population and also Arabic speaking population. So I have to apply my recommendations to make sure that they are given in a way that is applicable to their life and their culture. Because if they aren't speaking English fluently and I have to use an interpreter, likely they aren't eating the same things that every other American eats.
Mm,
So I have to make sure my recommendations are applicable to them so that they can actually implement it versus like, oh, she said I should eat this and we don't eat that in our house.
mm,
So it wouldn't
mm,
make sense to give instructions or recommendations in that matter.
mhm. This is a level of consciousness I don't think most people are taking, right? And awareness. Curious to know, did you personally take this on yourself? Did you go through a training program? Can we create a training program, if one doesn't exist? How did you come to have kind of this perspective?
Yeah, so coming from my Asian background, we eat family style.
Mm,
But in the more Western regions, like you eat with your own plate, and the US recommendations are using the My Plate to designate what you eat and how you should eat and how much you eat. That's a lot harder to do when you're eating family style.
mm,
So that's one thing I learned. Diversity is, I think, an issue across all fields, and it is difficult to. There are people who talk about it, especially those who work with a lot of minorities in the US, that we have to adapt the US guidelines
mm,
to help these families that don't eat the same way as your typical American.
mm.
So there is a population that is very conscious of that. And I do see it on social media. I see it amongst my peers. There are also different listservs where a dietitian who has no experience in a specific culture asks, like, oh, I have a patient who is asking about this food item. Like, can someone tell me about it and how we can incorporate this, or do we not? Like,
Yeah.
just to get a better understanding. And through those emails, sometimes you can tell, like, just how lacking the education is.
Mm,
But it's also really hard. The world is huge. Like, you can't
yeah.
expect one person to know every aspect, especially food culture in
Right.
every country. Um, so, a lot of it is now you have to listen. A part of my job is
Mm,
listening and knowing what questions to ask so I can understand better what food means to them in their culture and how they present food and how they eat. That's also different in Americans, right? Like every family is different. They
yeah.
might eat a certain way. Maybe they all eat individually. Maybe they all eat together. Like,
Yeah.
not one family is the same. And if you keep that in mind, that every American family is also different,
Mm,
you can apply that to a family that isn't American or that they are American but still eat more to their cultural background.
right.
And it's a lot of research and looking up, but just truly understanding what do you eat? How do you eat? And
Right.
how is it presented in the family?
Yeah. I actually think that this is so critical, not just because we have health problems or obesity is running kind of rampant and kind of all over, to be honest.
Yeah.
I think it's really relevant for now because we are we were already given the melting pot kind of model before, but it's even more now, I would say, not necessarily in that like beautiful American dream way, but in the way that we are not just redefining constantly in this country what we understand about so many things. But we see it in the way that even American food, right, has evolved. So take away all the mess of, international influences. Look at what's happened in the country itself, how people characterize it. I was recently asked, and I'm asked quite frequently when I'm living outside the States, like, okay, so like what are traditional American foods? Or they don't say traditional, they say, what are American foods? And I'm clarifying, like, you mean traditional? Like 1950s traditional, or like we're going like to 1800s, like homestead time, traditional. And they're like, no, like what does an average American family eat? And I'm like, that is such a hard question for me to answer. It's also an impossible question. And they're like, no, but you
depending on
must have
region.
exactly. And they're like, but you must have like specific foods. I'm like a like you mean like a hot dog? Like I'm just trying to say like like I'm like what are you trying to get at? And it's like okay, so like wait, I don't understand then. So like and I've actually people have had the audacity, and it's not just the audacity, it's like blatant ignorance to then say, "Oh, but maybe you don't know because you're Asian." And maybe because they assume that I just stuck, in my community, that I don't know how the non-Asians live, and they're like, "Well, is that really objective?" And then they have to hear it from a white person actually to believe that there is
Mm.
no uniformity. But that is why your work is so crucial and so necessary. I'm thinking about all the little kids, that because you do pediatric
Hmm.
work, right? So that is something that is an area that if you can start it there, those are patterns and those are habits that they can take for the rest of their lives. Like that is I'm just gonna like silent applause you without hitting my microphone, It's like,
There's so much to it, especially because even though my patient or client, however you want to word it, is the child, children don't cook.
no,
They don't buy their own
yeah,
groceries. So in the end, the change has to come from the parent or the caregiver or the guardian.
mm,
And a lot of times, like that's where the struggle is. And
mm,
it isn't until the child is in their teens where they're like, well, I can make the conscious decision. But in the end, it needs to be a buy in from the entire family. So you have to persuade everybody.
yeah,
This is what our goals are for the family that will
yeah,
most benefit this child that I'm seeing, but will also benefit everyone else in the family because it's not just the kid eating this one way.
right,
The pattern is across the entire family. So it makes it really difficult.
yeah. This is something I lived myself also as a multi-generational household with trying to. I struggled with a lot of different things, and it was for different reasons. I needed to modify my diet. This was seen as you're forgetting your roots, you are forgetting where what we stand for in this family once you bring your salads in here, or once and why I even started cooking was really just to take control over this. Posted today about like the whole Thanksgiving thing, but essentially it's like you have to see it as a unit, not just because oh, cultures are collectivist versus individualist. It's more than that. It's like the reality is everyone is eating together. Italians eat together. Do you know what I mean? Like it's not just
Yeah.
like Asian people, right? So like you have to really know how to adapt it for that individual family and what they go through. When you meet with people, do you meet with them together? Are you like so obviously the kid is there with the parents.
Yes.
Okay. Yeah.
Yes.
So
They all
it's
have to.
like
So it has to be at
yeah.
least one caregiver and
Mm,
then the kid.
yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Have you received any more direct pushback from other adults? Like, I'm so set in my ways. Like, this has worked in, like, what do you mean rice is unhealthy? Like, do you know what I mean? Like, have you actually
Yeah.
had more
So rice
aggression?
isn't unhealthy.
Yeah.
It can be
Okay.
incorporated
Yeah.
into a very healthy diet.
Yeah.
I have had patients tell me that they don't like to eat their Mexican food at home that their parents make
Mm,
because it's unhealthy.
mm,
And that's not true. Like our
mm,
ethnic cultural food is not unhealthy. It can just be made slightly different. American diet is not inherently unhealthy. We just have to make changes. So it's the same across the board. Like
right.
all our food items, it's how we put it together, it's how we cook it.
Yeah.
So it's not all inherently unhealthy. They just need tweaks. But I have received pushback. Sometimes they're just not they're not ready for change. And
Mm,
that's okay. Whenever you're ready for change, you can come back. And other times, maybe the kid and one of the parents or both the parents are interested, but it's grandmother who does the grocery
mm,
shopping and the
mm.
cooking. Or maybe the one comment that I've had is, well, dad works and he needs his soda.
Uh,
So we need to keep the soda in the house.
mm, yeah.
And that's like the hardest pushback because who am I to say how your family
Yeah.
should be run? So I have to figure out a way to work around those things.
Mm,
But again, if they're not ready for change, um, I'm not here to change you. I'm here to provide
mm-hmm.
recommendations and support to help you make the changes that would benefit you, but if you don't want them, I'm not forcing them on you.
Right. Yeah. These are considerations for you to take and for you to kind of implement in a realistic way. They are like it would be ideal, but also reality is that if you're in a certain family dynamic, and you certainly don't want to be um, adding, I think, to the complexity of family dynamics, right? Like, that Heather, that doctor, like it's just like she told us this, and like like what does she know, right? So there's so much care and sensitivity, I think, that goes into this work. When you see your patients, is it one-off sessions? Is it like, do you follow them over a period of time?
So it depends on their disease state, how sick they are, how much they need. So some I can see weekly, some I will see once a month, every 3 months, 6 months. It all varies.
Mm. I wonder if you do this privately also, because I kind of feel like do you do this privately
I
or
don't.
no?
I
Okay,
don't
because I
do this
kind of feel like it should
privately.
be, you know?
So like private is a whole other animal to tackle.
Mm.
And then it's also one, getting insurance for myself, but also, do you want to accept health insurances?
Right.
And that's a whole other monster.
Yes. Yes.
But if I want to do private practice and not accept insurance, I could charge a lot.
Yeah.
Um, like I've browsed, you browse people's rates and it's like, oh, $200 for an initial assessment. Like,
Right.
what? But like I think that's great for those who want to do that. But what I do is also very specialized, and I want to see the sick kids. So going private just doesn't fit my vision of what I want to do for myself.
Yeah. Yeah.
Also, like, you don't get paid if they don't show up. So,
Yeah. Yes. And yeah, yeah, I think all client work is kind of like one-on-one client or whatever client work is kind of the same. It's like we all, yes, there are different hurdles, and some people need to have insurance considerations, and there are other things to get set up. However, it's always the same. It's like when you receive a cancellation and you're like, okay, and so, well, for me, I have a cancellation policy, but even on top of that, I'm always like, okay, so then that means that, are you really in this? Like, do you really want to be like, you can't cancel 5 times in a row and tell me that like you are just okay, like throwing the money away because I'm not making any progress with you, right? So it's unfortunately I'm in this for more than the money, so
yeah.
because yeah, there's like not enough money in the world to, I feel like, incentivize me to do something I'm not going to believe in. So yeah. All right, let's flip to your night kind of stuff. So okay, tell
Yeah.
me how all this intersects in the world of audiobook narration.
So, I don't even know how to start. Well, let's start with the industry in itself. So, speaking of diversity and having across all fields, having to diversify, etc., there is now a huge push for authenticity. They want authentic narrators narrating books for example, if there is an Asian inspired story or an Asian author, they would prefer for the authenticity of the narrator, meaning they would want an Asian narrator also. So there is a push for that. And I don't think, because in the end, like, your voice, like, when you listen to an audiobook, you don't see their face.
Yeah.
So it's really easy to just not know who the narrator is. But I think, again, just the push for authenticity, um, not faking accents.
Mm,
Um, again, accent work is a huge thing too. Um, and that's also a discussion. How far do you push the accent before it
mm,
becomes uncomfortable?
mm,
And that's a discussion that I hear on a lot of different, or I read on a lot of different, like, narrator forums. But even for me, like, this is how I speak. So if I were to make an Asian accent, I have to generate that, right?
yeah.
So there's so many nuances, but ultimately in the field of narration, they are trying to diversify just the type of narrators that they have.
It's been kind of this oversimplified. I mean, the whole thing is oversimplified all the time, but it's oversimplified to say Asian character, because again, what does Asian mean? We have to get more specific.
Yeah.
But Asian character, Asian actor, Asian voice, like Asian look, like what are we actually talking about? Because everyone sounds kind of different. Also, I don't know if you're familiar with the Asian American accent, but it's a thing, and it's something that I hear. I know, like I know what people are talking about, but not everyone sounds that way, you know. And
Yeah.
I personally changed my voice intentionally when I was in high school because I received kind of peer feedback that I sounded so weird, and I didn't want that. You know, I wanted to feel accepted. And so, I mean, I changed it later to be more natural, but for a certain time, yeah, like talking about faking accents, I do think that is something that many people who come from immigrant backgrounds kind of, you walk that really early because you're kind of like, I'm kind of imitating, but it's also me, but it's also like, it's not totally me, you know, and you like kind of try on different characters and voices and personas.
Yeah.
A little
Even
sad,
like
yeah.
you mentioned like the Asian accent like in school, but it also varies by region,
Mm. Oh my God.
right?
Oh my God, yes.
Like in the US, like I remember like my Philly friends, my Philly Asian friends, they
Mm.
sounded different,
Yeah,
right? Like,
yeah,
and then it just there's so many different cultural nuances. It's not even like cultural as in like my cultural background, but
right.
cultural as in like society,
Yes.
like the
Social
societal
culture.
culture.
Yes.
Yeah.
Not ethnic culture. We're like we're looking really micro at this point, right? Because
Yeah.
yeah, okay, great. Born and raised Washington D.C. metro area. Go like just trying to say this in a way that everyone understands. 10 kilometers that way, and you will find someone who does not speak anything like me, right? And they can look exactly like me. They can have a family background, a family story that's as complicated as mine and interwoven and, you know, from the same regions. The output, like the what comes out at the end, I just kind of feel like there should not be an expectation anymore that everything kind of track in a uniform way. It's and you obviously exemplify that. I feel like many people do. So, okay, let's talk specifically about your audiobook work because
The one that I'm currently working on is called The Dragon Spy.
yeah.
And it is really cool.
Mm,
I'm not just saying it just because like I'm the narrator,
mm,
but the premise is one, it's like a historical young adult fiction. So it's like placed in the Cold War with
mm,
Germany and West German, like West Berlin, East Berlin, like how it's split.
mm,
Um, and then on top of that, my character is an Asian American. And the author is actually really good. He actually touched upon, like, oh, the amount of times that someone, like, questioned, whether or not I was an American or whatever, like, that
mm,
was in there. So that was nice to see. And it's also fantasy. So it's like spy, thriller, fantasy, historical fiction.
mm.
And I was also cast for that for authenticity because the main character was Asian American.
Right. I'm wondering if we can kind of like come full circle and tie this into the conversation with your dad about boxing yourself in. So can you kind of answer that your feelings on, I think on the one hand it's great like for authenticity and for all that. Does it limit you? How do you see this?
So right now, if anything, all the authors who are interested in me because of my Asian American background.
Mm,
The first book that I did was also Asian, although the first book was a Korean American, not Chinese American.
mm.
But again, there's only so many of us. So we did get
Us being
us as an
audiobook,
Asian,
yeah, yeah, us being Asian American
Asian,
audiobook
yes.
narrators, right? So yeah, this is yeah.
Yeah. So like, so there was, talking about accents and whatnot. There was a Korean accent in there that was not required. The author did not push me to have to like force this Korean accent.
Mm,
And I didn't feel comfortable with doing it
mm,
because it didn't feel right to me. So I actually didn't, I made it like more of a character change than an
mm,
accent change.
mm,
But everyone's a little different. But I didn't feel to my core right about creating this Korean father accent that
mm.
felt in my mind um I don't know, insulting,
Yeah.
right? Um, what was the point of my story?
I think the point is, do you feel like do you feel like it boxes you in
Okay, yes,
versus
yes,
yeah.
yes. Okay.
Yeah.
So so if anything, I feel like me being Asian American is what's giving me work right now.
Mhm.
Do I want to branch out to other things that are not Asian American focused? 100%. But if this is what's giving me work, I am down for it, you know? And
Um,
when I audition, it's not like Heather Ling is a very neutral name.
mm,
If you Google it, you'll actually see it's a flower. The
mm.
entire name, Heather Ling, is a bush.
Is it really?
Yes, it's a flowering purple bush.
Oh, wow, yeah.
But there are it's you don't see that name and inherently think, oh, she's Asian.
Mm,
Okay. Especially Asians can't really pronounce Heather at
mm, mm,
baseline either.
right.
It's a very British English name.
Yeah.
My mom struggles with pronouncing my name. So
Yeah.
so it is clearly not focused on being just Asian.
Mm,
So I feel like when I'm auditioning, they're not choosing my voice not because I'm Asian. They're choosing my voice. They're not choosing my voice because they found another one that's a better fit, right?
mm,
And that's okay. That's just a part of
mm-hmm.
the job. But currently, all the work that I am getting is because they want an Asian American to narrate their work.
Right. I feel people who know a bit about the subculture in this country and the pressures. Granted, I don't know if you live this, but audiobook narration is not on the approved list for Asian American children to be doing as career paths. And therefore, I don't think that there was much encouragement, right, over the generations to get people to, I mean, anything arts related, right, to enter. And therefore, there's a supply issue that's working in your favor, right? But at the same time, I don't think it would be remiss to say that you're obviously capable of more, right? Like you're capable of playing other roles. You're capable of doing many, many different things, right? And you already do in your other life. And I do think that's kind of the eternal struggle with where we are in history, because I think many people feel this no matter their kind of family background or their language, right? Like, how does this actually influence how I'm being chosen, what I'm putting out there? That's why your first post on this was like the first post I saw from you and how we connected. That was so interesting because I don't think there's a right answer, at least not yet, right? Like the story is still ongoing. You're still
Yeah.
living. Yeah.
Yeah. I think it is interesting just to see where my path will take me.
Mm-hmm.
But I do follow other really, really popular Asian narrators, and some of them are actually mixed. And
Mm,
just seeing like what types of books they end up narrating for. And again, in the end, authors and publishers are picking you for your voice.
yeah.
So I'm not of the mindset to think that me being Asian American is what's holding me back.
Mm,
It is, I need to develop my craft better.
mm,
So if I need to work on acting, on my voice, on like the resiliency and the endurance of my voice, like these are things that I have to work on.
mm,
And I think if you think that you are boxing yourself in or you think you only fit into one category, that's a mindset thing.
mm,
So for me, if I'm not being hired by non-Asian authors, that is something that I need to improve on is my skill. I'm
mm,
not changing who I am,
mm,
but I can say that everyone can be better than what they are now. I can
yeah.
say that my first book versus my second book that I've improved, right? Like all I can do is work on my skill set and keep pushing forward. If an author chooses to not choose me, not because of my voice, but because of my background, I wouldn't want to work with them anyways,
Right.
right? We're not going to be happy with the product.
Right. Yeah. This is crazy powerful. Thank you so, 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 so much. You didn't know me. I didn't know you. I really, really appreciate you taking the time, to connect. And then we talk like all the time now. So,
Yeah.
I think it's amazing. I want to see if you're comfortable and you can say no. I'll just cut this out if you say no. I'm wondering if you can kind of do different voices or accents for the audience to kind of get like I didn't preview you, I'm sorry.
No, it's
But
okay.
like, yeah, to get a taste of like what you do and how you can modulate your voice. I've seen some of your videos, so I know like that you
Yeah.
work on it constantly.
I'd kind of have to try and find something.
Mm. Okay, let's
So
roll tape.
I found a little part.
Yeah.
Um, so it's actually in my audio sample. If you go to my website,
Mm.
it's a little excerpt from a book. But it has a little bit of a female voice and a male voice, and then also Mandarin.
Mm.
So I'll just do a quick very quick little blurb.
Mm.
Mom, she greets me with a burst of Chinese that I can't understand. Mom, it's Gracie. You need to speak English, okay? 说英语. Mom sees Sam behind me, and her eyes widen. 小何? This I understand. No! I nearly lunge forward. This is Sam, a friend. From work. He's a friend from work. Work friend. To Sam, I say. She thinks you're her little brother. Sam comes into the room and reaches his hand out. 你好，我叫 Sam. 我是你女儿的同事. I bless the app because Sam spoke slow enough to let me understand what he said. Mom blinks again. 你好. She glances at me. Gracie? Sweetie? We'll just stop there.
Oh my God. That was so good. That was so also the guy part. Um, you sound like my little cousin. It was like extremely monotone. Sorry, not to oh my God, not to
Nice.
say that you were monotone. It's just the way that his voice comes out is so funny because I feel like when we lower, and it's I do it for fun, like as a female to lower my voice and kind of like change it, right? Like I'm when I make fun of guys, I'm like, oh, so you wanted to go there, right? But I do it the same in Mandarin, and then I realize, oh my God, no, he actually speaks like that. So you actually reminded me of him, you know?
That makes it even more real.
Yeah, it
If I
does.
remind you of someone you know in your life, I did it
Yeah.
right.
Yeah. And let's again remind the audience or the listeners that Mandarin is not your native
No.
language. Yeah.
Yeah.
So you doing Mandarin and an accent and like changing not only the language, but like you played a female and a male character in this, and also the mother and also the
Yeah.
like, yeah, okay. So like many things going on and a lot of
Yes.
talent, okay, over
Thank you. I
like
appreciate
on this side. Yeah. Thank you for doing that. I really, I think that was such a nice treat. So thank you for being here. Thank you for your energy, for your time, for sharing a bit about your story. I hope that one day, if you ever do choose to go into private work for your day job, I have
it.
so many people I could recommend you to, so you absolutely would not have to worry about clients. I think a lot of people, need it. Yeah.
Thank you. I really appreciate the time that you've given me. And honestly, like all of our conversations, like on Instagram and all that, they've been really, really enjoyable for me. So